Ethan Carter, a 25-year-old software engineer, had just finished a long shift at his job and was heading home through the quiet streets of the city. The night air was crisp, and the only sounds were the occasional distant honking of cars and the faint chatter from late-night diners. Ethan pulled his jacket closer around him, eager to get home and rest. As he turned a corner near a dimly lit alley, flashing red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the pavement. Before he could react, two police officers stepped in front of him, their hands hovering near their holsters. "Stop right there," one of them commanded. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He quickly scanned the area, wondering if there had been some kind of emergency. "Is something wrong, officer?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. The officers, responding to a report of a robbery that had taken place nearby, eyed him suspiciously. "We need to ask you some questions." One of them, Officer Reynolds, said, "You match the description of a suspect seen in this area." Ethan's eyebrows furrowed. A suspect? He had done nothing wrong, just walked home like any other night. He felt a surge of frustration but knew that reacting emotionally could escalate the situation. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hands slightly and kept his voice calm. "Of course, officers, what do you need to know?" As one officer began to radio in his information, the other studied Ethan carefully. Looking at his clothing, his bag, and his face, the atmosphere was tense. Ethan could feel the weight of their scrutiny as if he were already guilty in their eyes. A part of him wanted to protest, to demand an explanation, to ask why they thought he was involved in a crime he knew nothing about. But another part of him knew that any resistance, even verbal, could be misinterpreted, so he did what he had learned to do in situations like this. He remained composed and cooperated, hoping the misunderstanding would be cleared up quickly. Little did he know, the night was about to take an even more unexpected turn. Ethan stood under the bright glow of the streetlights as the officers scrutinized him. The tension in the air was palpable. His mind raced. What exactly had happened in this area that made them suspect him? He had walked this route dozens of times without incident. Sergeant Bradley, a tall, broad-shouldered officer with a hardened expression, stepped forward. "We got a report about a robbery not far from here," he said, his tone firm. The suspect was described as a young male, medium build, wearing dark clothing. Ethan glanced down at his attire, dark jeans, a black hoodie, and sneakers. His stomach tightened. A vague description like that could match hundreds of people in the city. Yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. "I understand, but I've just come from work," Ethan explained, keeping his voice even. "You can check, there are security cameras at my office. I didn't rob anyone." Sergeant Bradley exchanged glances with his partner, Officer Reynolds, who seemed slightly less certain. But Bradley wasn't convinced. He took a step closer, eyes narrowing. "Where exactly were you about 15 minutes ago?" "I was still at work," Ethan responded, trying to stay calm. "I left maybe 10 minutes ago. You can call my manager if you need proof." The officers didn't immediately respond. Instead, Bradley crossed his arms, looking Ethan up and down. "The victim reported that the thief ran in this direction," he said slowly. "And you just happened to be walking this way?" Ethan exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his voice. "Officer, I walk this way home every night. This is my normal route." But his explanation didn't seem to matter. The suspicion in their eyes remained. Officer Reynolds sighed and pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Look, we just need to take you down to the station for some questions. If everything checks out, you'll be free to go." Ethan's stomach dropped. Taken into custody? For what? He hadn't done anything wrong. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his pulse quickening. Sergeant Bradley gave a half shrug. "Just a temporary detainment for questioning." Ethan knew that technically, this wasn't the same as an arrest, but he also knew that once he was taken in, things could spiral out of his control. He clenched his fists, willing himself to stay composed. "Fine," he said, forcing himself to remain calm. "But I want to call my lawyer the moment we get there." Bradley smirked slightly, as if amused by the request. "You can make your call at the station." As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around Ethan's wrists, a deep sense of unease settled over him. Something about this situation didn't feel right. And soon, the truth would change everything. Ethan sat in the cold, dimly lit interrogation room, his hands resting on the metal table in front of him. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. and the distant hum of voices from the main office echoed through the walls. His wrists were sore from the handcuffs, which had only just been removed. Despite his frustration, he kept his composure, knowing that losing his temper would only make things worse. Across from him, Sergeant Bradley flipped through Ethan's wallet, pulling out his driver's license. His eyes lingered on the name for a moment, his expression shifting from stern to slightly puzzled. He handed the ID to Officer Reynolds, who furrowed his brows as he read it. "Carter?" Reynolds muttered under his breath. Bradley's head snapped up, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Wait, Carter? As in Judge Carter?" Ethan said nothing, watching as the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Their body language changed in an instant. Gone was the rigid confidence, replaced with uncertainty. Bradley stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a screech. "I'll be right back," he muttered, snatching Ethan's ID and walking out of the room. Ethan exhaled slowly, his heart pounding. He had expected them to check his record, maybe even verify his alibi. But their reaction told him something else was at play. Reynolds remained in the room, avoiding eye contact as he fidgeted with a pen. The once interrogative officer now seemed unsure, as if he regretted how things had escalated. Minutes passed, each second stretching unbearably long. Ethan remained silent, his mind racing. He had seen this dynamic before, how quickly the system treated people differently when they realized they had detained someone with influence. Finally, the door swung open, and Bradley re-entered, his face pale. Behind him was a higher-ranking officer, Captain Monroe, the precinct's commanding officer. Unlike the others, Monroe's expression wasn't just one of recognition but concern. "Mr. Carter," Monroe said, his tone more respectful than before. "I think there's been a mistake." Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You think?" he said dryly. Monroe cleared his throat. "Your father is Judge Thomas Carter, correct?" Ethan nodded. The captain shot a sharp glare at Bradley and Reynolds before turning back to Ethan. "We're going to clear this up right away. You're free to go." Ethan didn't move. "Just like that?" Bradley, who had been so sure of himself earlier, now looked at the floor. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. Monroe sighed. "I understand you're upset, and I don't blame you. This shouldn't have happened." Ethan clenched his jaw. He had spent the last hour being treated like a criminal, searched, detained, interrogated, until they realized who his father was. He wanted to be angry. He was angry, but more than that, he was disgusted, because if his last name had been different, he knew this night would have played out much worse. The tension in the room was suffocating. Ethan sat still, watching as Captain Monroe and the officers exchanged silent, uneasy glances. Then, the door swung open again, and an older man in a neatly pressed uniform stepped inside. The golden badge on his chest reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above. Police Chief Harold Dawson. Ethan recognized him instantly. He had seen his father speak highly of Dawson in the past, an officer who had built a reputation for enforcing strict but fair policing policies. But right now, Dawson's expression was not one of authority, it was one of shock. "You're the son of James Carter?" Dawson asked, his voice laced with both disbelief and concern. Ethan met his gaze and gave a slow nod. "That's right." The room fell silent. Sergeant Bradley shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence now completely gone. Officer Reynolds rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding eye contact. Dawson exhaled sharply and sat down across from Ethan, his piercing blue eyes searching his face. "Your father and I go way back," he finally said. "He's a man of integrity. He spent his whole career making sure that things like this didn't happen." He shot a pointed glare at Bradley and Reynolds. Ethan felt a tight knot in his chest. He had grown up watching his father fight tirelessly for justice, lobbying for police reform, advocating against racial profiling, ensuring fairness in the courtroom. And yet, here Ethan was, sitting in an interrogation room, handcuffed just moments ago, treated like a suspect before anyone had even checked his story. "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Which makes this situation even more ironic, doesn't it?" Dawson's jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the table. "Tell me exactly what happened." Ethan recounted the events of the night, the officers stopping him, accusing him based on a vague description, refusing to listen when he explained his alibi. He didn't exaggerate, nor did he hold back. When he finished, Dawson turned to Monroe. Did anyone check the security footage from where he works? Monroe cleared his throat. Not yet, sir. Dawson's eyes flashed with irritation. So you brought him in without verifying anything? Bradley, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. We were just following protocol. Sir, he matched the description. And we. Dawson held up a hand, cutting him off. Protocol? Protocol would have been confirming his whereabouts before throwing cuffs on him and hauling him in. He let out a sharp breath, rubbing his temples. You do realize that if you had just checked security footage first, none of this would have happened? Silence. Ethan folded his arms. And if I weren't James Carter's son? He asked. His voice calm but pointed. Would we still be having this conversation? Dawson didn't answer right away. His face remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, acknowledgement. He turned to Monroe. Get this young man's record wiped clean of this nonsense. Now, then, fixing Bradley and Reynolds with a cold stare. He added, and we're going to have a very serious discussion about how this department handles suspects. Ethan remained seated, watching as the officers scurried to obey. He had gotten lucky tonight, not because of justice, but because of his last name. And that, more than anything, left a bitter taste in his mouth. The atmosphere in the room shifted as if someone had flipped a switch. Just moments ago, Ethan had been treated like a criminal, his every move scrutinized. His words doubted. Now, the officers who had been so firm in their accusations suddenly seemed uneasy, scrambling to justify their actions. Sergeant Bradley cleared his throat and looked away, his earlier confidence replaced with visible discomfort. Listen, Mr. Carter, he started, his voice noticeably softer. We, didn't realize who you were. This was just a big misunderstanding. Ethan studied him, unimpressed. A misunderstanding? That was all they had to say? Officer Reynolds nodded quickly, as if eager to smooth things over. Yeah, we were just following protocol. You know, we had to respond to the report as quickly as possible. No hard feelings, right? He gave a nervous chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. Ethan raised an eyebrow. No hard feelings? He repeated, his tone neutral. Bradley shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting Ethan's gaze. There was something in his expression, shame, perhaps, or at least regret. He knew exactly why this situation had escalated the way it did. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the cold metal table. Tell me something, Sergeant, he said evenly. If I hadn't been my father's son, would I still be sitting here? Would I still have been cuffed and dragged in for questioning without evidence? Neither officer answered. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Ethan could see it in their faces, the reluctant acknowledgement that they had jumped to conclusions. That if his last name hadn't carried weight, this night could have ended very differently. Dawson, still standing at the doorway, let out a tired sigh. Bradley, Reynolds, he said, his voice firm. You both know damn well this wasn't just a misunderstanding. You didn't follow protocol, you followed an assumption. Bradley swallowed hard. We were just doing our job. Sir, he tried again. No, Dawson snapped. Doing your job would have meant verifying his alibi before putting cuffs on him. Doing your job would have meant treating him with the same respect you'd give anyone else. Instead, you saw a young man who fit a vague description and decided that was enough. Ethan watched as Bradley's face flushed red. For a man who had spent years enforcing the law, being called out in front of his superior had clearly shaken him. Reynolds, still eager to fix the situation, forced a smile. Look, Mr. Carter, we're really sorry about all this. It won't happen again. Ethan let out a slow breath. He wasn't sure if he believed that. I hope not, he said simply. The apology felt empty, not because it wasn't genuine, but because it had only come after they had realized who he was. Had they learned a lesson? Maybe, but would anything actually change? That, Ethan wasn't so sure about. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, studying the officers in front of him. He could see the tension in their faces, the way their eyes darted away from his. Unable to hold his gaze for too long, they knew what he was about to say, but that didn't make it any easier for them to hear. Would you have believed me if I wasn't my father's son? He asked. His voice calm but sharp, cutting through the heavy silence in the room. No one answered. Sergeant Bradley shifted in his seat, clearing his throat as if trying to come up with a response. But none came. Officer Reynolds looked down at the table, tapping his fingers anxiously. Even Captain Monroe, who had been standing near the doorway, rubbed his forehead as if Ethan's words had struck a nerve. Ethan sighed. That's what I thought. The silence that followed was deafening. No excuses. No justifications. Just the uncomfortable weight of the truth settling over them like a thick fog. Ethan continued, his voice steady. You didn't stop me because I was guilty. You stopped me because I fit the description, a description so vague it could have been half the men in this city. But that was enough, wasn't it? Reynolds finally looked up, his face slightly red. It wasn't like that, he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Wasn't it? Ethan challenged, raising an eyebrow. Then tell me, if my name had been Ethan Jones instead of Ethan Carter, would you have let me walk out of here so easily? Would I have even gotten the chance to explain myself before being thrown in the back of a patrol car? No answer. Bradley clenched his jaw. His earlier embarrassment had faded, replaced by something closer to defensiveness. Look, he said stiffly, we made a mistake. We're acknowledging that. Ethan gave a humorless chuckle. A mistake? He shook his head. A mistake is writing the wrong address on a police report. What happened tonight wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. And the worst part? If my father's name hadn't meant something to you, I'd still be sitting here in cuffs. Bradley looked away, his lips pressed into a thin line. Dawson, who had remained silent, finally spoke. You're right, he admitted, his voice quieter than before. It was a choice, and a bad one. Ethan exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment to process everything. He had known from the moment they stopped him on the street that this wasn't about evidence, it was about perception. And tonight had proved, once again, that perception alone could determine someone's fate. He wasn't naive enough to think this conversation would change the system overnight. But as he looked at the office's faces, some guilty, some uncomfortable, some angry, he knew he had forced them to confront something they weren't ready to admit. And maybe, just maybe, that was a start. Chief Dawson exhaled heavily and folded his hands on the table, his expression more serious than before. Ethan, he began, his tone softer now. I won't insult you by pretending that an apology is enough. What happened tonight was wrong. And if we don't acknowledge that, we'll never fix it. Ethan held his gaze, searching for any sign that these words were just another empty promise. He had heard plenty of officials say the right things before, talking about change, about fairness, but action was always harder to come by. Dawson continued, I'm going to make sure this department reviews how we handle stops and detainments, especially when it comes to vague suspect descriptions. Bias, whether conscious or not, should never dictate how we enforce the law. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And what about the officers who do let bias dictate their actions? Dawson didn't flinch. We'll start with better training, more accountability, and most importantly, we need to listen. When people say there's a problem, we need to take it seriously instead of getting defensive. Sergeant Bradley shifted in his seat, looking like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Officer Reynolds remained quiet, nodding slightly, as if the reality of the night's events had finally sunk in. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He was still angry. He should be angry, but he also knew that frustration alone wouldn't solve anything. You say you want to change things, Ethan said carefully, but change takes more than just words. I don't want this to be some PR stunt where you make a few tweaks and call it a day. Dawson nodded. I don't either. He hesitated for a moment, then added, you've seen firsthand what needs to be fixed. If you're willing, I'd like to work with you on making sure we get it right. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. You want my help? You have a unique perspective, Dawson said. You understand the system from both sides, your father's work, your own experience tonight. That makes you valuable. If you're up for it, I'd like you to be part of the conversation moving forward. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't expected this. A part of him wanted to walk out of that station and never think about this night again. But another part of him knew that if he didn't take this opportunity, the cycle would just continue. Finally, he nodded. All right, but I'm not here to make you feel better. I'm here to make sure this doesn't keep happening. Dawson gave a small smile, the kind that held a quiet understanding. That's exactly what we need. Ethan stood up, feeling the weight of the night settle over him. This wasn't the ending he had expected, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something bigger. Thank you all for watching. We appreciate your support and hope this story gave you something to think about. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next video.